The question arises, does Heckscher-Ohlin theory explain actual trade patterns? Heckscher-Ohlin theory gives a strong theoretical foundation for understanding gains from trade, effect of trade on production and consumption, and also on prices and incomes of different factors of production, which according to Heckscher and Ohlin ultimately decides why countries export some products and import others. Heckscher-Ohlin theory was first tested by Leontief to test whether countries really export products whose production requires more of the country's abundant factors and import products whose production rely on more of the country's scarce factors, or it works the other way around. To understand it more closely, let's read about Leontief paradox. The economists emphasize the kinds of information that we need to examine real-world trade patterns, factor endowments and trade patterns, along with knowledge of the factor proportions used in producing different products. This chart provides evidence on endowments for 7 factors: physical capital, highly skilled labor, medium skilled labor, unskilled labor, crop land, pasture land, and forest land, and it discusses endowments of other natural resources for U.S. It provides a side-by-side comparison of the factor content of each $1 million of United States exports and the factor content of each $1 million of imports competing with domestic imports. Unskilled labor comprises a relatively smaller proportion of United States exports than United States imports. Capital, such as plant, equipment, and inventories, content is relatively larger in imports than in exports. Farmland rents comprise a larger proportion of exports than imports, and mineral rights comprise a smaller proportion of exports than imports. This chart provides evidence on endowments for 7 factors: physical capital, highly skilled labor, medium skilled labor, unskilled labor, crop land, pasture land, and forest land, and it discusses endowments of other natural resources for Canada. It provides a side-by-side comparison of the factor content of each $1 million of Canadian exports and the factor content of each $1 million of imports competing with domestic imports. Unskilled labor comprises a relatively smaller proportion of Canadian exports than Canadian imports. Skilled labor comprises a smaller proportion of exports than the skilled labor content of imports. Capital, such as plant, equipment, and inventories, content is relatively smaller in imports than in exports. Farmland and forests, as well as mineral rights, comprise a larger proportion of exports than competing imports. There is also an evidence on international factor price equalization. While it clearly does not hold perfectly, even if we define factors carefully, we do see tendencies toward factor price equalization. Most obviously, as countries in Asia have integrated themselves into world trade, real wages in these countries have increased, to lessen international wage gaps. For China, increased demand for less skilled workers has led to rapidly rising real wages. For India, wages for workers in business services have been rising relatively rapidly. Let's have a look at China's trade patterns, and the case study focus on China. China has been an interesting example which shows the growth of trade over last decades. Its trade, only comprising of 1% of world trade in 1980, flourished to reach at a level of 10% in 2014. This graph clearly supports it by displaying China's exports and imports from 1976 to 2016. More exports than imports also reveals that China has a positive balance of payment. Much of China's trade is consistent with the HO predictions, especially once we recognize China's role in labor-intensive assembly of electrical and electronic products that are then exported. Time to give a hands-on to real work.